All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Marc-Olivier Bordeaux. I'm the marketing coordinator here at Consortech. Today is the fourth episode of this FME Server webinar series. We're going to talk about applications integration. And I just want to point out that it's really fun because we have a lot of new people joining us today. I saw a lot of IT people signing up for this webinar, and it's good to see that FME is used across organization in different departments and not only in GIS. So for everyone that's been here since the beginning, thank you for following us and thank you for being here. And for the others, well, welcome. So, as I said, I'm going to be the moderator. I'm going to be managing the questions. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the section on your left. I'll try to give them to Patrick at the end of the presentation. So, Patrick, it will be the presenter for today. Hello, Patrick.
Hello.
With over 8 years experience in the field of geospatial ETL and spatial analysis, Patrick holds a bachelor degree in geography from the University of British Columbia. As a geospatial ETL developer at Consortech since March 2015, and FME Server certified professional since December 2018, he has been involved in a number of projects involving ETL solutions using FME, desktop, server, and cloud. He also provides consulting services such as solutions, architecture, GIS workflow optimization, training, and end-to-end GIS solutions. So, Patrick, here you go.
Thanks, Marco. So let's jump right into it. So we will be talking about application integration, like Marco said. So we'll start off very high level. Here's an agenda of what we'll be talking about. We'll start off with a brief description of what is application integration. Then we'll talk about how to connect to various applications, specifically using FME, what type of data can be retrieved and also pushed to these different applications, and we'll finish off with a few demos, 3 specifically. So we're going to identify 3 different types of application integration, and we will be demoing 1 for each. As I mentioned, our go-to tools for application integration in this webinar, and most of the work that we do here at Consortech involves some level of, utilization of FME. So think of, building your automated workflows in FME Desktop. You deploy them on FME Server or FME Cloud to really leverage those automation functionalities, whether we're dealing with schedules, directory watching, and as we'll see here, FME Server REST API calls. Great new functionality in FME 2019 for those of you that have attended the webinar on automations that was held a few months ago, right, Marco?
The first one was 4 months ago. Yeah.
Yeah. The automations one was a few months ago, right?
Yeah. Introduction to automations.
There we go. So in this, if you see this slide here on the left-hand side, it's sort of a brief overview of what automations look like in FME Server. Again, it's they've sort of beefed up their automation functionalities, because before, I think, like with subscriptions, topics, publications, you really needed to wrap your head around what the logic needed to be to be able to use or fully leverage automations. With this new interface, it's a lot easier, a lot more comprehensive. So basically, you can add these boxes and connections. So very similar to what FME Desktop looks like, to set up triggers, to run workspaces, and also connect to different systems or applications, whether these applications are sending out SMS notifications, pushing data to another web service, and so on. So, without further ado, what is application integration? So, broadly put, application integration is the mechanism that allows data to flow from one application to another. your organization likely manages data in many different systems, so maintaining these updates across different platforms could become a challenge if you don't necessarily have any syncing mechanisms in place. So application integration can really bridge that gap and help propagate a single point of truth across these different platforms. So think of assets like fire hydrants or land parcels. It's very likely these assets are present in some way, shape, or form in different systems. So you might be maintaining geometries in your GIS, but more descriptive information like permit data, for instance, might be maintained elsewhere. So in order to maintain accurate data in all these systems, you'd likely need to build bridges between them. As I mentioned earlier, and we'll be demoing these 3 different types of application integration, I've split them into 3 groups. This is typically what we've seen, what we've been working on, different projects. I see a few clients here in the attendee list. You might recognize some workspaces if you've worked with us. But essentially, we've got 3 here. So application to system. With basically these workflows typically involve a get method. We've got system to application. So we can think of any inserts, updates, or deletes to records in, let's say, ArcGIS Online based on data in a, let's say, like in an enterprise GIS or another corporate database. And last but not least, we have application to application. So this typically involves a combination of get and post methods. So for instance, application to application integration could involve the comparison of the same assets stored in different applications to consolidate the information across these different applications.
Patrick, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
So obviously you've done a few projects of applications integration in the last year, let's say. So on top of your mind, do you want to name us a few applications or a system that you've integrated?
So we've used a number of applications. It really depends what the need is, but we've basically, with FME connected to, let's say, Salesforce, SAP, we've connected to Amanda, we've connected to CityView, CityWorks. We've even, developed these workflows that bring data in from, let's say, Uber. So essentially, FME really plays that sort of like orchestrator role and manages these calls. It's a pretty fun tool to be able to work with these different applications. It makes it really easy. Mm-hmm. Another example here. So let's say an application to system. We do have a client that has used, let's say, for instance, an external API. In this case, we are dealing with the tree plotter API. So basically, it's sort of an application that manages where these, let's say, where trees have been planted around the city. It's an external application, so they basically use FME to back up that application data into their corporate GIS. We can also think of application to system when we are updating our enterprise geodatabase with application data. So whether it's fire incidents, parking zones, budget, or facility data. In this case, we have a client that has developed a workspace to identify the parking tickets that were issued but didn't necessarily contain any zoning information. So basically, they had different zones for parking tickets. We can think of like the parking rate for different zones, or it might be different. There is missing information in the application, so they wanted to do some further analysis. They've used FME internal data to basically cross-reference these geocoded points from the application. So in this case, it's an application to system because we are leveraging another API in that FME workflow. So basically, we're geocoding these points based on a relative position. So let's say like a cross street, to then also update the data in that BI, or also to update a corporate database. When we're dealing with system to application integration, like I mentioned earlier, it could be something like updating ArcGIS Online feature services based on data that's in, let's say, your corporate GIS. So in FME, that's sort of the under the hood type application integration, because it's a conventional writer in FME, but in the back end, what's basically happening is an API call to that web service. It could be something that's as simple as generating an HTML report. That HTML report, let's say it's hosted in let's say like on your intranet, or to, let's say, the public. You're basically pulling data from, let's say, like an in-house database, or let's say flat files. You're joining that information using FME, and you are generating report for the public that's hosted somewhere. And last but not least, this is one of the demos we'll be showing. We can, with FME, extract, prepare data to then be pushed into into an application. So basically, what we're doing here, we're mapping some attributes, but we're also preparing and formatting the data. In this case, it's going to be in XML, because it is a SOAP call. It must be in XML to essentially push that or update the data in that web service. And application to application is the third type, and it's probably the most common form of application integration out there, simply because most web pages integrate multiple applications through APIs. So for this webinar, think of FME Server as one of these applications. It can receive a trigger from another application using either a webhook or a server-side call. We'll talk a bit more detail as to how these applications speak to one another, and what tools are used in FME Desktop and FME Server to receive and process these communications.
Patrick, quick question. So if you don't mind me asking, what would be the advantages of using FME Server in applications integration compared to, let's say, like all the other apps out there?
So I think in FME Server, or FME Server, whether you're using desktop or server or both, I mean, like, you basically have to develop that workflow in FME Desktop. I think the common trend is you don't necessarily need a thorough background or an extensive background in programming to make that happen. So obviously you would need to know a bit about FME, but as you can see, I mean, for those of you that are more or less familiar with it, you can see that it's basically a combination of boxes and connections. We will be using the HTTP caller in these demos, which really sort of makes it a lot easier. You can basically parameterize that transformer and make those calls happen. All right. So our calls usually have something to do with an API. So basically, we are making a call to an API, whether it's a SOAP or a REST call. I will talk about in further detail as to what the differences are between those two. But first and foremost, an API is essentially a link that allows the communication between two or more applications. Like I said earlier, APIs really are everywhere. Anytime you send a message using, let's say, WhatsApp or Messenger, you're checking the weather on your phone or searching for accommodations on Airbnb, you are using an API. So that, let's say that web browser, that app is actually making a call to an API. You're able to connect securely to applications. So think of an API like a database view. The data that's exposed through an API can be controlled. So when you're connecting to an API, you're likely only accessing what's necessary. And again, APIs are easily accessible. So even with little to no programming experience, you can easily access APIs and leverage them into your own data workflows. For SOAP and REST APIs, I've got two of the demos that I'll be showing. Show one of them. So we'll be showing these two interactive demos later on in this webinar. One showing each of them. So really to sort of further understand what the difference is between these two different types of APIs, REST versus SOAP. I've used the FME Server REST API documentation. It gives a pretty simple explanation as to what the differences are. So, like a REST API, it allows authorized users to access a predefined set of protocols and standard operations. So I've just taken a screenshot of, let's say, like the standard operations that we can do to access, let's say, the automations functionality in the FME Server REST API. So I would say the main difference between a REST API is the native HTTP methods for identifying resources and performing actions on them. So you can see here we've got a list. In contrast, SOAP APIs reinvent these two key pieces, which adds complexity to the implementation and usage. So SOAP APIs are usually more secure, and you're basically it's a lot of trial and error, I would say, in FME. Well, I mean, I'm used to sort of connecting to APIs using FME. It would pretty much be the case with any other type of programming language. With SOAP APIs, there is a lot more trial and error, what I find, because there are certain sets of, let's say, tags in your XML or formatting of that XML that needs to be sort of properly set in order to make those calls. So to make it happen with FME, I mentioned the HTTP caller. It's pretty much your go-to transformer to make these these calls to different APIs. This is sort of I've opened the parameters, I've taken a screenshot, so you can see here we've got a request URL, and then we've got, let's say, our upload body here that is defined to essentially make a post. So in this case, what we're doing, we want to generate a token to then further on in our workflow utilize that token and make further calls to the API. On the right-hand side here, another screenshot. This is a web service authentication using your Esri credentials to connect to ArcGIS Online. So in this case, under the hood, what it's basically doing is that it's generating a token. It's using OAuth to make that connection to the web service, and then basically you're connected. You can utilize those different functionalities that are accessible in that web service. So let's jump into it. So this Euro Tempest feed, this workflow will basically retrieve files from an API. Now, there are different steps in order to achieve that file retrieval, but it is an application to system type integration. So let's get out of here and let's open up that first workspace. All right, you know what? I'll clear the cache. Just run and stop. There we go. Okay, so I'll enable feature caching. The reason why I'm enabling feature caching is that I'm going to halt the process at each HTTP caller. So you can see here in my workspace, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 HTTP callers. In this case, what we're starting with is a post. So similar to what we saw in that screenshot, we are using that request URL to get a token, and we are retrieving our parameters. So it's asking you for a user and then the API ID. So in this case, obviously, you would need to be authenticated prior to basically leverage that or utilize that API. Usually, API IDs are sort of like a one-time ID that, or it's basically it's managed within your like a secure account. So, let's say you are managing your different API keys with different Google products, for instance. Like you can log in, go in the Google developer page, and then see the different API IDs that you've generated. So in here, we're making a post. So we are posting that information to the web service, and we are retrieving a token ID. So it's not necessarily the token ID that we're retrieving. It's not like the actual value, but it is in JSON format. So if we run this, inspect that data. Whoops, bring it to the other side here. There we go. So I've opened up my token ID attribute in my data inspector, and I can see here I've generated an API token. That token will expire within about an hour or so, but I can still use it in my workflow here. So I'm fragmenting that response that comes in JSON, and I am storing that information. I'm exposing that API underscore token. So that attribute can therefore be used in subsequent calls to the API. So notice here, the next thing I'm doing, I'm retrieving feed information, so I can have different feeds. I will be storing that response in an attribute, and similar to what we've done in this case here, you'll notice that I use a JSON fragmenter to fragment the contents of that JSON. I'm doing the same thing here. So next one here, based on that feed information, I'm sort of drilling down into the different, so like the different URLs. So let's say here, API/feeds, and then my next HTTP caller, I am drilling down and really finding the information relative to that feed. Notice here, I've got my API token still to in my header to basically authorize, and the response will be stored in a file attribute. Let's go ahead and run this. Ooh, rejected. What happened here? Might be that the feature caching has been disabled, or basically the token it was using is no longer valid. So that's very possible. Let's try to run this end to end. I'm still getting a, no, I should be good. All right, I'm going to stop this, rerun this. Sort of the drawbacks of using feature caching sometimes is that the token was basically cached. We actually did this webinar in French before, and I was actually caching the information. So I assume that's what was going on here. So if I run it once again, ooh, rejected again. What's going on? Okay.
Joys of doing
oh yeah,
live webinars.
Live webinar. I didn't. Yeah, so I don't have like a pre-canned workspace that works every time. The joys of troubleshooting on the fly whenever everyone's looking at me, right? Isn't that great? Yeah, I can see here that this is in GMT. I assume it's because the token has expired. So I don't know. I'm not able to. You know what? I am going to close this, and I am going to reopen it. All right, let's give it a shot. Hey, there we go. Okay. Feature caching, the joys. So this is the response. I can see here that I've got a wide range of files that are accessible. For the sake of this this demo, what we'll be doing here is we'll be adding a sampler so that we're not downloading each and every file. But again, here I'm creating one object per file. I'm setting my download path to download those data sets. You know what, Marco? I will. Let's see here. Where did this go? I've actually downloaded them prior to, but what I'll do is just remove those data sets and restart. So I've got my download directory here. So C data demo Euro Tempest. And here what I'm going to say is instead of downloading all the 500 plus data sets, I'm going to limit it to the first 10. And drilling further down into the request URL, I've identified the feed, doing a get method, and then based on the attribute file, which we see, let's see here. Once we fragment that JSON, what we'll get here is a full path, so where I want to download that file, and it's got the extension as well. So I don't necessarily need to define what the destination format is. So I'm downloading this file, and then in my HTTP response, I can say, well, save the response body to a file, and then I am defining the output file name in my attribute here, full path. So we can see here, C, data demo, Euro, Tempest, and so on. So let's test this. Let's open up that directory here. And we can see that the files are being downloaded as the workspace is going through. And basically, I showed sort of like an application, not necessarily to system in this case, but what you can do afterwards is determine what you want to do with those files. Like, do you want to download those 550 plus data sets every single execution, or do you want to set up sort of like a check in that workflow to say, you know what, I've already processed this file, do not reprocess it. I only want to process the new ones. All right, done with this demo. Let's hope it's the only kink in this webinar. So next demo, system to application. So this demo is taking transactional data that was exported from I believe it's a banking application. It is a manual export. Just because we weren't able to utilize that API, I believe it was because it was a paid API. So there is a process in there that is a manual export, and those exports are placed in a temporary directory. This workspace will take that export of transactional data and will be pushing into a web service. So this demo actually has three. There's one orchestrator workspace that will handle each of what we call the child workspaces. So this is one of the children workspaces that takes the CSV data, does some attribute mapping, defines what the tags should be in the XML. Now, I'm using XML because it is a SOAP call. It's not a REST API call, so unfortunately I can't use JSON as a format. But basically, the really important transformer in this workflow really is that XML templater. Now, I've defined what the template for the XML that's to be pushed to that web service should be. And to do that, I've actually used an application called SOAP UI. So I can basically create these, it's sort of like a test environment. I've actually used SOAP UI to define or to figure out what that template should look like. Like I mentioned with SOAP, sometimes it really depends on what type of call, which type of application you're pushing data to. In this case, for this specific client, we've actually set up, I believe, 4 different types of pushes that we can do to the application. Each of them actually having its unique set of requirements in terms of, or rules in terms of these tags. So for one call, I would, for instance, not necessarily need this allocation key to be defined, whereas in another call it might need to be. It was a challenge. There's a lot of back and forth because I didn't necessarily have access to the destination application. In this case, the destination application actually gave me would give me further errors. even when the response from the HTTP caller would be a response 200, which means everything the call to the web service was successful. So back to my XML templater here, each individual transaction will be put in this batch input tag. So in this case here, these are my transactions. So notice here, this is sort of a reference. Each individual transaction will have this format here. So you'll notice here the format to basically plug in the values from that CSV that was matched up in FME is this format here. So basically FME : get attribute, and then what's the attribute? It's account in this case. So once I've populated that XML, I'm outputting in an attribute called text line data, using text line data because I'm using a text file writer. And what it should give me is, let's go back here, demo, processed, and it should give me a output XML. So that would be the first step. Create the XML, and then the other child workspace that would run would basically take that output XML. There's a bit of attribute mapping that's done, but really the magic happens in this SOAP call using the HTTP caller. So again, very similar. I think in FME, there isn't much difference between the REST API and SOAP requests other than the upload or the content type. The content type here, as we can see, because it's SOAP, it must be an XML. We define our headers, and we make the call. So I can just sort of inspect what that call looks like here. So I will be pushing the value of my attribute text line data into my SOAP call. So you can see here, this is pretty much the same XML that I'm pushing to the web service. All right, so that is for the system to application. And last but not least, demo application to application. Now, unfortunately, this is an application that we've developed on one of our clients' environment. I do not have a working example of that front end application. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to mimic the interaction between that front end application and how it actually interacts with the FME Server REST API. So think of that front end application as, let's say, like a data upload service where a user can log in, drag and drop a file in that window, define what the form, so basically the values in that form, in this case, what the market is, the type, the design type, and so on. And once they click that submit button, what happens? So basically, we make a call to a specific function in that REST API. So in this case here, we are posting the information that comes from the web application, and we are posting a message to a topic. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show in a browser what that looks like on the FME Server side. So this is my FME Server REST API documentation. And what's fun is that I can actually test out these different calls. So I'm in my notifications section here because topics are part of the notification manager. I'm going to scroll down all the way to the notifications topics, and then which topic I should post the message. And then this basically says it's sending a message to that specific topic. Just to test it out, let's say, for instance, this information is sent to the or from the application to FME Server. So we are making a call to the REST API. And what I'll do here is I will go in my other window here. I'm just going to clear the results here. I'm doing some topic monitoring. So what's happening here is that I'm making a call to that topic, and this should receive the message. Now, the last workspace, and this is just a dummy workspace, it's actually going to be triggered using the, basically from the web application. The web application makes a call to the REST API, which then sends a topic, and the topic will trigger that workspace. So notice here I've just called it orchestrator as a workspace. If I go back to my jobs, we'll see it a little later. So just keep in mind it's so it's a 336. We should, once we trigger that call, we should see the notification being sent and then the workspace being triggered. So let's give it a try here. Try it out. We get a response code here, so that's good. We get our sample topic message, so notice here it's the same date time, and this is the JSON that is passed in the topic. Now, next, what we'll do here, I'll just refresh this page. We should see a workspace that has run. So we see it here at 1536. Let's just open up the log file here and see what we've done. Again, a dummy workspace. Basically what I've done, I just used a JSON flattener to flatten the attributes and expose the attributes that I wanted. So I still wanted one object, and I've used a logger just to show what the attributes are, what the exposed attributes are. So we can see here design type, file name, market, and so on. So you can see here that FME Server really is sort of like the middle piece between different applications. We are making a call from the web application to another application, which is FME Server, but that application could also be making other calls to different applications. So let's say if we go back to our slide here, we could be pushing that data to a system. We could be notifying either through an SMS or an email notification, which is another API call or a call to an application, or we could basically be rerunning a workspace. So this pretty much wraps up the demo and theory side of the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free.
I got a question actually, Patrick. How do I know whether a service is accessible or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think a lot of the stuff I've done here is pretty implicit, because I've basically worked on different types of projects, and it looks sort of like, hey, this is the template that I should be using. This is the format of the URL. But think of if an application is accessible, you would likely have an API. If there's an API, there's likely documentation out there to better inform you as to which calls you can make. So if I take the example of the FME Server API, well, I do have a set of actions that I can take here. And the documentation is pretty thorough in this case. I mean, it basically tells you each and every type of call you can make based on the different sections here. So the FME Server, just one of the applications, but I mean, let's say you were wanting to connect to, let's say, like the Strava API. I mean, we can basically just say Strava API. What does that tell us? Usually there's API documentation. It's unavailable. Wow, okay. So assuming, let's say, explore the API, well, that's fine. All right, thanks, Strava. So if you really wanted to find documentation based on a specific API, I would say Google would be your best friend in this case. Just type in API or the specific API and then documentation, and I think you'd be good to go.
All right, so send us your questions, and in the meantime, just want to follow up on the next webinars. Next month will be the Directory Watcher webinar, and if everything goes according to plan, we should have a guest speaker from Safe Software's FME Server's team that will join us for this webinar. On March 11th, we'll have the apps webinar, and on April 15th, we'll have the REST API webinar. So thank you for everyone for being here. If you have any comments on the webinar series, feel free to send them my way. If you have any questions, more technical, you can send them to Patrick. We're more than halfway into the series, so there's there's something you would like us to include in the webinars or any comments, feel free to send them. And you can access, if it's your first webinars, you can access all the other webinars, the past webinars on our website. They're all on YouTube, and you should get the recorded version of this by the end of the week. So I see that there's no questions right now. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Patrick, for doing this webinar.
Thank you.
And have a great day, everyone. Oh, it was someone saying thanks. So thank you.